Wilson now has two 98 square inch 16 by 19s, the Blade 98 and the brand new RF01. They might look similar enough on paper, but today we're going to talk about just how different they actually are. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets and Runners. So naturally, since the RF01 came out, I've gotten a lot of questions about it, and actually a lot of questions asking me to compare it to specific frames. At first I wanted to make a video comparing it to the Blade, E-Zone, and Aero 98, but that's not going to be today because I haven't actually reviewed the RF01 yet, so I wanted to spend a little bit more time talking individually about it. I may do something on all four of them, maybe even add a couple more in there if that's something that would interest you, but today I'm going to keep it to just the RF01 against the Blade 98. Now of course, before we get into this comparison, let me remind you that any of the rackets we talk about on this channel you can check out on our website racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me and the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comments section what you want me to cover next. So I picked this comparison for obvious reasons. With the introduction of the RF01 to their lineup, Wilson now has two 98 square inch 1619s. If you think that's overkill, I can understand the sentiment, but I'm always for more rackets, and honestly, beyond those two specs, they're not actually that similar. The RF01 has a 98 square inch head size, a 16 by 19 string pattern, it weighs 300 grams, and then has an undulating beam that starts at 23.2 millimeters up here, then goes down to 23 millimeters and finishes off at 22 millimeters in the throat. The Blade has the same 98 square inch 16 by 19 string pattern, that's the last time I'll say that, but it weighs 305 grams and has a constant 21 millimeter beam. They also have different stiffnesses. The Blade flexes at 62 RA and the RF01 at 64. I know that's only 2 points difference, but in practice it's actually bigger than that, and I'll talk about why later. They also do have slightly different stock target swing weights. Strung with the exact same string, the Blade swings at 325 and the RF01 at 318. I think 7 points is the target difference, although with Wilson quality control, you never really know. The other major difference between these rackets is the technology going on inside of them. The Blade is peak Wilson technology. It has a combination of 45 braid, but especially stable feel, which is there to expand the sweet spot and stabilize the frame while still maintaining good feel. The RF01 also has 45 braid, which admittedly does make the flex a little more adapted to the modern swing, but you don't feel it too much, and other than that, it's really raw. There's no stabilization technology, which is becoming more and more rare for a player's racket nowadays. The only other thing to note is that, like the RF01 Pro, this racket is foam filled, and I'll talk about how that affects feel very soon. So those three things are where most of the playability differences stem from: the beam thicknesses and designs, the stiffness ratings, and the fact that the Blade is very tech forward and the RF01 is not. We're going to start with feel and stability because that's probably where these differences are the most obvious, and I have to say, playing with these back to back, they are the perfect example of how modern technology affects playability. It's kind of funny because the RF01 has a more modern shape than the Blade, but in terms of feel, it's way more classic. When you make good contact with the RF01, you get this crisp, responsive, and super well-defined feedback that makes its way into your hand, and you can use that feedback to get dialed in. The feel on the Blade is way different. You get much less direct feedback when you make contact in the sweet spot. The technology in there makes it quite a bit more muted and ambiguous. Now I know there's foam in the RF01 and not everyone's a fan of how foam affects feel. It does mute vibrations a little bit, but there's a big difference in how foam mutes this racket compared to how the layup technology mutes the Blade. Foam kind of smooths things out, similar to what a dampener does. It makes for a cleaner overall feel, but that feedback is still very much so there. I know people who like feeling every little vibration are going to argue that, but it still allows the raw graphite to shine. In the Blade, that stable feel tech is part of the actual carbon layup, and that totally changes the way the racket flexes and pockets the ball. I think we're slowly getting used to this because almost every racket has some sort of technology like this nowadays, but I want to make it very clear, this is way more overbearing on ball feel than foam. Now the Blade V9 does have better feel than the last couple of generations. The more they develop this tech, the better they're getting at maintaining feel, but that classic graphite feel is still the main sacrifice they make to implement it. The thing is, there are huge benefits to this tech. I call it stabilization tech, but I think a better name for it would be easier playability tech, because what it does is allow rackets like this Blade to be playable at a lower swing weight, even at the highest level. Stable feel effectively does what adding weight to the hoop would do. It expands the sweet spot so that it's more forgiving on off-center hits, but it's not getting heavier, so it's still easy to swing. Again, it's so obvious when you hit with these back-to-back. Despite the fact that they have similar swing weights, the Blade is a much more user-friendly racket. The sweet spot is way bigger. Yeah, it may not be as sweet, but that's the trade-off. And I do just want to address one thing. In the RF01 Pro video, I said that racket has a very small sweet spot, but also a very well-defined sweet spot, and some people were like, yeah, that's classic marketing jargon. He just doesn't want to say it's a punishing racket. It is a more punishing racket. You have to add weight to the hoop here if you want to make it as forgiving as the Blade, but in doing that, you'd be making it harder to swing. If you want the bigger sweet spot, you have to go with something that has this technology, but then the feel in the sweet spot isn't as good. Now, most people these days prefer the more user-friendly racket. That's why all these brands are developing even their control rackets this way, and I'm going to say it right now, I think that's the right way to go. Feel is slightly overrated because you'll eventually get used to the feel of your racket, and if you can swing faster with proper technique, that's most likely going to improve your tennis. To me, the RF01 is more enjoyable to hit with because I really like more classic feel, but more people are going to play better tennis with the Blade because it is easier to use. We are going to move on from feel now, but it's a huge part of the difference between these rackets, and it really shouldn't be overlooked because it does represent the old school and the new school very well. I'm actually really happy we're making this comparison because these two rackets are going to help me explain another thing I make reference to a lot in these reviews: precision versus control. Precision is when you aim the ball in a direction and the racket puts it exactly there. Basically, a precise racket responds perfectly to player input, and that's exactly what you get with the RF01. The higher stiffness and undulating beam are very important in giving it that great precision because together they make for a shorter dwell time, and that's part of what makes this racket so responsive. The other thing is that it has really good directional control, which wasn't always going to be a given when I first saw this racket because sometimes these undulating beams can be a little bit wild, but not here, at least not when you're hitting offensive shots. This is one of the best rackets if you're an offensive player looking for that point and shoot precision. The fact that it has such good feedback also helps, but what you don't get here is that more forgiving, guidey type of control. This is when the ball spends a little longer in the string bed and you're almost able to use that dwell time to grab and place it. A lot of players, especially counter punchers, need this type of control because it allows them to slow things down, feel the ball in the string bed, and hit a higher percentage shot. That longer dwell time also gives you a bit more margin to correct your stroke because the ball doesn't shoot off as instantly, and when you're not perfectly on top of your game, that's very useful. Because it's softer and has a constant beam, you can do that much more easily with the Blade. You may even see in this footage, there are times where I'll take a few steps back to have a little more time to place the ball. It's quite difficult to do that with the RF01. That stiffness and beam design is a bit of a double-edged sword. The dwell time is so short that if you do decide to slow things down and hit with more defensive technique, it can become a little random. I'm also going to quickly talk about the Pro Staff 97 because it's been the gold standard for point and shoot precision for I don't know how many years, but it's also better for soft control than the RF01. It still has pretty short dwell time, but the difference with the Pro Staff 97 is that it has a constant box beam, which does soak up the ball a little more than the undulating beam here, and that makes it more consistent when you do slow down your stroke. This is a more rigid racket, and rigidity is the opposite of what you want when you're looking for soft control, so even though the Pro Staff 97 isn't the best for that style, it's an example that you can combine the two better than with the RF01. Now the Blade certainly isn't bad for precision, but what I was saying about the feel being a little more mushy than the RF01, it's definitely not as good if that's the style you're looking for. That more ambiguous sweet spot does take away from the really responsive, dialed-in feel that is so important when hitting with precision. This is the most precise Blade since the 2015 version, but there is still a little ways to go to bring it back to its scalpel-like prime. Once again, these rackets have pretty unique power profiles and really outline the main differences between easy power and top-end power. Easy power is often referred to as easy depth, and because the Blade is so forgiving, it is easier to generate power with. You don't always have to make perfect contact to hit a good enough shot. In fact, going back and forth between these two, I almost got a little lazy with the Blade because it's so forgiving all over the string bed that you don't have to concentrate as hard. That was not possible when I switched to the RF01. When you hit it off center, the ball can fly. It can also just die right there, so that's not easy power, but when you hit it sweet, it can rocket off the string bed. Like I was saying in the control section, the beam design and stiffer feel make this a pretty rigid racket, which is what gives it such high power potential. Again, that's super beneficial for the offensive style that this complements so well. Precision with power is a recipe for ending points quickly, and that's definitely what you get here. The Blade doesn't necessarily lack top-end power. In fact, it's quite good and better than a few of the previous versions. Because of the way Wilson laid up their graphite with the V7 and the V8, they sort of bottomed out when you reached a certain point in their flex. I don't really get that as much with the V9, even though it is still a little mushy. I do find it sharpens up right as the ball exits the string bed, which can add a little more oomph to your shot. Spin is similar to power in that it's easier to generate spin on the blade, but it's certainly not lacking on the RF01. The blade's grommets are more open, which allows the strings to move more freely, and then the layup technology in here does pocket the ball in a way that's a bit more complementary to modern spin technique. When you combine those two things, you get really easy access to spin on the blade. It's quite atypical for a racket with a more control-oriented design like this, but it just shows that technology really can amplify certain important elements of the modern game. The RF01 has a lot of spin potential, but it does require more sound technique and a faster overall stroke to tap into it. You can't kind of half-heartedly flick your wrist to generate spin the way you can on the blade. It has to be a conscious effort from the beginning to the end of your stroke. Now, one thing I haven't talked about much is how these two designs differ when you're swinging the rackets through the air. The RF01 has a fully oval beam. The blades is more D-shaped, where it's flat on the inside and then round on the outside. This oval beam is really aerodynamic, definitely more than a box beam, and even a little more than the blade's D shape, which makes the RF01 pretty darn quick and very whippy. It is quite easy to generate racket head speed here, which obviously complements the spinny windshield wiper style very well. If the swing weights are equal, it is a little bit quicker than the blade. Of course, a lot of you are going to add weight to make it more stable, but just look at it this way. It's quicker than average for whatever swing weight you end up landing on, which is great for spin. So both of these can generate impressive spin, but I do think the blade's more spinny technology trumps the faster speed of the RF01. It has easier spin and a bit more top-end spin, so it is overall a more spin-friendly racket, but again, you won't feel like you're lacking any on the RF01. So the blade and the RF01 are great examples of two rackets that might seem very similar but are actually quite different. The RF01 is a great racket for offensive players who are looking to take the ball early and dictate play. It's obviously evolved from precision rackets like the Pro Staff, but power and spin are much more adapted to the modern game. Now that might make it sound really well-rounded, and in a way it is. As long as you're hitting fast offensive shots, it does have more variety than something like the Pro Staff 97, but it's not as well-rounded as the blade. The real drawback with the RF01 is that it doesn't have very good defensive potential. I sort of alluded to this already in the control section when I mentioned it doesn't respond very well to that soft, guidey type of control. I didn't really talk about this, but that also applies to more margin-oriented spin shots. You have to be really crushing into the ball to tap into its good spin. It doesn't really like going for slower, loopy spin shots. The blade is much better when you are looking to hit with margin, and it responds well to more defensive technique. It's also quite good when you press on the gas, although not quite as good as the RF01. The other thing is that the blade is a much more user-friendly racket. That's just a reality and a huge benefit of implementing more technology in a frames design like this. What that means is that a lot of players can play their best tennis with the blade. There's a reason it's the most popular control-oriented racket. The RF01 is much more geared toward one specific player type, but I also think it's maybe the best racket in that category. My big recommendation is to know what you're getting into with the RF01. It's the kind of racket that you'll quickly hit a wall with if you don't have the game style to use it, and because of that, I don't think it's ever going to be as mainstream as the blade. That being said, it's a super addictive racket to play with because it does have kind of magical feel that, like I said, you can't really find much anymore. Personally, I love playing with it. We'll see how well it works for my game in the long run, but for now, that is going to be the end of this review. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you do want to demo the blade or the RF01, you can come visit us in store, or if you want to buy them, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.